Hello and welcome to our viewers around the world to our AgriBriefing webinar, The Food Cycle, the Supply Chain and Disrupting the Commodity Markets. My name's Mike Verdin, I'm the editor of Agrimoney, and I'm joined by a fantastic panel to discuss this. We have from the AgriBriefing stable, we have Helen Dufour, who is a Strategy Grains. We have Gary Morrison from Urner Barry in the US. We have Heather McGuire Doyle from Feedinfo, and also George Griffiths, who is our expert in chief on all matters shipping. He is the editor at Global Container Freight at S&P Global Platts. Welcome to you all. I just want to say a couple of things to start off with. First of all, from an agricultural perspective, how this has taken me and I think many others by surprise. Coming into 2021, there were many unknowns like La Nina, but the shipping crisis is something that really caught me off beam, and it's something I want to find out a lot more about. And indeed, can't wait to get hold of George to talk to him more about it. And also the structure of this will be, we're trying to make it as forward-looking as possible. We've heard a lot about the Los Angeles, the container ships outside Los Angeles, about the huge freight rates from China to US. But things have moved on. The Baltic Freight Index, other indexes are available, as I'm sure George will tell us, is down more than a half from its high early in October. We've got the Omicron virus now on the horizon. We've got lots of things to discuss in the future, and let's try and focus on that after a bit of talk about where we are at the moment. So without further ado, we'll just get on to George and tell us, I suppose, how did we get here? If you can just perhaps tell us shortly kind of where we are now and how we got here.
Super, thank you very much. And yeah, as you say, I'd quite like to make this as forward-looking as possible, but of course, in order to look forward properly, we do need to understand exactly as you say, what's happened over the last 2 years, 18 months or so. It really, if you cast your minds back to the very start of 2020, pre-pandemic, there was a few months at the start of 2020 before we had COVID kicking around, and that was IMO 2020 regulations came into force. And this is what everyone was expecting to be, the game changer for shipping going further forwards. They've changed the amount of sulfur that you could burn at the high seas from 3.5% total content to 0.5%. And that, of course, pushed freight rates higher, pushed costs of moving goods around the world slightly higher. But then we had all of this COVID that we've seen so far. Very start of COVID, we saw China go into full lockdown, which really stopped a lot of the exports. And when everyone was in their full work from home status and everyone in proper lockdowns, and we all remember those images from around the world, there wasn't that much being shipped. And that, of course, changed as we came out, end of the summer months, going towards the end of 2020. We saw the market really change from there being no demand to there being far too much demand for the market to handle. And of course, on top of this, because people hadn't been moving things in, lots of ports had let staff go, who'd then gone off and found other jobs and things like that. So it was almost the perfect storm that we really saw. There was a lot of demand and not a lot of staffing to be able to move these containers from the ships inland. And what we ended up with is a real shortage of containers in the market. And with there being a shortage of container freight, this is not, it's not some kind of grand larceny, no one's stolen them. It's merely the fact that it takes longer for them to be taken from the ship inland, emptied and returned, meaning the containers were in the wrong place. And on top of that, we've had all those issues that I'm sure we're all aware about, those queues that Mike was just saying in the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. The Ever Given in the Suez Canal in March, of course, caused a lot of issues for people on the supply chain. And we've seen the same. We've seen lockdowns in Ningbo Port, Yantian ports, Port of Los Angeles, Port of Long Beach. So really, some of the largest ports in the world have really been impacted this year. And that's just left to an escalation in prices. I mean, just by way of comparison, freight rates from Asia to Europe in 2019, pre-pandemic, were somewhere around the $1,500 to $2,000 level. And they peaked this year at $18,000 from Asia to $18,500 from Asia to the UK, which is not a small increase, almost 12-fold on the year, which is really quite considerable. And the same happened on the Trans-Pacific lanes. They were going from $3,000, something like that, up to, I think the highest I saw was $25,000.
And it's not just containers, is it, Gary?
It's not just containers. Sorry.
No, I mean, just mention, because I know you say you describe dry bulk as your pet project, as it were.
Yes, I was going to say, it's not just containers, because of course this is having a knock-on effect. It's not only not only agricultural commodities that move on containers, but we're seeing a bit of upside from that, from sort of the container aspect. People are trying whatever they can to circumvent these enormous costs. If that's consolidating cargoes and putting it onto small dry bulk ships, if you can, we're seeing those who are able to do that doing it, which is of course pushing up the price of dry bulk, and that's seeing further and further increases. And then on top of that, we also have there's sort of the trade disputes that are ongoing between China and Australia, which means that people are having to source goods from further. So even just to move the same amount of commodities around the world, we're starting to see it take longer to move those commodities. Therefore, there being fewer ships available, which has really pushed up the cost of dry bulk as well. And equally, sort of same, but not to the same degree on tankers. So shipping this year has really gone from one of those costs that you don't really think about, and a transient cost somewhat, to almost as valuable, if not in some instances more valuable than the commodity itself than it's moving. And this is a real issue. I mean, it's always that that joke of you buy something online and you can spend $250 buying a dress or whatever, but if it costs you $10 to ship it, you suddenly think, ooh, is that really value for money? But if you're trying to move 20 tons of rice, which might be worth a couple $10,000, but you're moving them in the shipping in a container that might also cost you $10,000, suddenly you start the questions start to come out, right, as to whether that is fair value for money. And the situation has been ongoing, and hopefully as this conversation goes on a little bit, we'll pick apart what we're expecting to see further forward.
Got you. And that kind of gets us to early October, when the Baltic Dry and other indexes kind of peaked, as you mentioned. But I always say, certainly at Agrimoney, we always think that when a story makes national news from our sector, it's a good time to sell, and that looked like it was a good time to sell in early October. Why did rates suddenly go down, shipping rates from October to mid-November?
It kind of got to an unsustainable level. I mean, in terms of fundamentals, there's not that much that changed. There wasn't some sort of market shifting news, really. It's just that they sort of peaked, which I know sounds like a slightly flippant comment, but it reached an unsustainable level. There actually wasn't that much demand going on at that point, and a whole load of these ships that had been tied up on longer voyages suddenly came back into the market, and it was the shift away from that level of demand back towards the supply side, which really pushed the dry bulk levels down. But now, as we're sort of reaching towards the end of the year, and of course you always see a lull, pre-Christmas, right? Nobody wants to be working in the factories over Christmas and doing these kind of things. You see a big shipping spike in July, August, September, October, and then it comes down. It's almost the inverse of what happens in containers. Whereas in containers in September, October, November, you see a big spike typically, because people want to move goods. Everyone wants Christmas presents, right? Everyone wants things underneath the tree, and this is one of those cyclical moments. But I was looking at the pricing on this side earlier on today, and it's not out of the normal in terms of the shape of the curve that it's gone. It's just been elongated. The highs are much higher than they've been, and the lows are proportionally much lower compared to the highs. Actually, the shape of the curve is largely the same, and it just shows that the market fundamentals haven't changed. Compared to last year, people are very keen to get infrastructure back up to recoup lost costs that were of course happened in 2020, to make sure that goods are finally moving around the world again. Because it's not just sorry, conscious that you want to say something, Mike, but I just...
Yeah, well, I was going to say, because from an agriculture perspective, because I know, just to say, George used to work on the agriculture desk at Platts as well, so that's another of his pet projects. Whether they're the rates have come down, but has it been particular for container ships, or what kind of agriculture vessels that are associated with agriculture have been more affected than others, should we say?
Well, I mean, really on the dry bulk side is where the where the ags team have really seen things hurt. It depends what you're moving. I mean, if you're moving rice and sugar, things like that, and you're more bespoke products, that's when you're going to see the container freight rates impact. And it's not necessarily just the high costs, it's also the enormous delays that are associated with it. You can pay through the nose, you can pay 10, 15 times higher than the year before, but you're not guaranteeing delivery at any given time because there are so many issues at the ports, in the hinterlands from the ports, things like that. On the dry bulk side, we're seeing exactly the same. Things are being pushed a little bit, but you're still growing largely the same amount of goods. You're still moving the same amount of goods around the world. In 2019, I think, is when we had African swine fever. So of course that stymied quite a lot of the demand of soybeans and soy meal from South America up to sort of China and North Asia. But the agricultural markets are still are still growing, if you'll pardon the pun there. But really, the impact that we've seen and the knock-on effects that have come into the dry bulk market this year have come from the other dry bulk commodities, your steels, your scraps, your metals, coal, things like that, which are drawing tonnage from the other regions. That if there's not enough to go around for coal or pet coke or whatever it may be, then ship owners will take a clean vessel and then put sort of this dirty cargo in it, knowing full well that at some point they're going to have to clean it back up again. But it's that risk or reward. So it's not just the agricultural sector that's impacting the shipping markets; it's the other ones that are really drawing it back as people.
Of course, but it's for our readers and for us as journalists, it's agriculture that's affecting us and causing us headache and heartache or whatever. The other thing I was going to look at, the energy shortages that we've had over the last few weeks, has that had an impact or not?
It has a little bit. I mean, obviously, as the energy shortage started to happen and we started to see prices rise, across the oil complex and of course across the sort of entire energy complex, we're seeing costs for moving goods increase. Actually, if you are one of the owners themselves, which makes a slight bit of reluctance to decrease them further. But also, we're seeing as a result of that. There are large scales of outages of power across China, which is something that people are really talking about at the moment, which is in some degrees a blessing and some degrees a curse, depends on which side of the equation you're sat. That they're not able to produce so many goods, which means that ships are leaving slightly less full, which is not great if you have goods down that chain that you're trying to get onto those ships. It's kind of annoying. But equally, if you're one of the ports in the US or in Europe, you're seeing ships come over with slightly less than full capacities, which means that you've just got that little almost gasp of fresh air, which are enabling them just to shake off some of the logistical issues that they're having at the moment. So it really depends where in the pile you are. Because right now, lots of these shipping liners are preferring goods that they can dump quickly at the other end and then pick up another cargo. You don't want to be sat waiting around in a port or waiting around in queues if possible. And if you're in a very fortunate situation in the agriculture markets where you do have one of those goods that you, at the other end, you have a very quick turnaround, then the shipping liners will much prefer to take your cargoes, even if it's at exactly the same price, because they get their vessel back much faster.
Is there a general feeling which agricultural goods are easier in this perspective than others?
I think it really depends on where you're. I mean, just by way of example, where you're moving them to. There's the Tate and Lyle factory just down the Thames from where we are now. And if you're moving sugar, you can drive your sort of ship straight up to it, empty it out, and then take it back off again. So it's things like that. It's the ones that you have a really integrated supply chain in the ports around the world. They're obviously going to be favoured at this point significantly.
Yeah, very good. And so we've kind of get to the kind of where we were perhaps until a few days ago, and then there's another spanner in the works, whatever you like to call it, black swan, I think probably a better term in terms of the Omicron variant. Even in ag markets, that's had a huge effect over the last week. Has it affected shipping markets at all?
Yes, immediately. We haven't seen. Of course, the scale of this is unknown, right? I mean, no one knew even at the start of the very first throes of the pandemic quite how bad it was going to be, and this is looking bad. We're seeing lots of governments putting in new restrictions again. Even here in the UK, face masks are coming back in and things like that, and so people are running scared. This appears to be quite a nasty place. We've seen commodity markets and financial markets already take a bit of a tumble over just the uncertainty that this is coming, and with that we're seeing a spike in shipping already, only a week in, because a lot of players in the world have suddenly thought, oh goodness, are we going to go into another big lockdown? The port of Dalian in China has already shuttered some operations at this point because they've had a breakout there. They've had some cases, so they've stopped that, and people have that concern of, oh gosh, are we going to see this be more widespread? So we're seeing a tick up, not just in containers and dry bulk, but in anything that moves across the oceans. We're seeing a tick up in, because people are, it's what we call in the container space front loading, trying to just take whatever cargo they need and stick it on a ship now and pay up, they'll happily pay a premium for it, just to make sure that it does move before the world sort of goes back to hell in a handcart, is I think the way that we're seeing it. And that's the same, the same thought is of course echoed all around the world. Everyone's trying to move goods before we go into a full winter lockdown, which is looking increasingly more likely.
Yes, it's kind of almost seems strange about shipping rates going up when the economic kind of predictions are perhaps going down. But Now you explain it, one can see why. So we are where we are. And have you any kind of clues as to where we might be going? And again, perhaps, taking containers and dry bulk separately.
It's I would say the $1 million question, but it's the multi-billion dollar question. Really, is where we're going. But yeah, I'll take them separately, and I'll do dry bulk first, maybe mix it up a little bit rather than talking about containers all the time. Dry bulk appears to be on the up for a little bit, but equally, as with everything else, we have a bit more supply coming in. We have new ships on order, and so there's a little bit hope that will offset some of the demand. Of course, it's always fairly finely balanced, but actually, compared to where rates were, as you said, Mike, back in October, they've come down significantly, almost halved in some instances, if not slightly more. And this is giving people a little bit more optimism. But as we say, with this Omicron sort of variant coming in, or however you're supposed to pronounce it, as we see that sort of coming in, we're seeing a little spike in terms of demand, and then we'll see, presumably things rebalance again. But this is a fairly weak time in these global markets. People have covered a lot of what they've done for what they lost in 2020. We've seen these huge spikes in terms of demand for the actual commodities themselves, scrap, steel, coal, whatever it might be. We've seen that impetus come back, but actually we're back down to about 2019 levels. People have rebalanced their markets, people have rebalanced their stores, and so it's almost expected to be the same slightly volatile pattern, but going back to 2019, 2020 levels, where it's a lot more condensed in terms of the extremes that we're seeing upwards and downwards. Short term, a little bit of uptick. We're still uncertain as to how this new variant is going to impact us, but slightly longer term, it should be, I don't want to say smoother sailing, but at least heading back, towards something useful. But of course, adding into this as well, and adding sort of onto the next level, we're also going to start to see. It really depends on what happens with trade wars, right? What goes on with Australia and China is the big focus for dry bulk, and hopefully there should be some kind of consensus at least coming out of that in the new year. That's the expectation, is that we'll start to see a little bit of potential easing there, easing in some of the tensions.
Okay. Perhaps we'll move on to that in a second. But are there any seasonal patterns anyway against which this is playing? And you mentioned about the fact that you often see a fall this time of year. It's just been elongated. What would the seasonal pattern?
So the seasonal pattern typically comes. Dry bulk shipping's weak in December, January, February, March, because a lot of the dry bulk ships that move things will move from the Baltic region, from Canada, from things like that, which are starting to see ice. And as soon as you start to ice up those waterways, you have fewer vessels that are ice class that can actually go through and service some of these ports. And so that's why you typically see tonnage outweigh supply in the wintry months. And so that's why we see rates go slightly lower at this time. And that's what everyone's still expecting. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I've been shivering merrily in London up to this point because it's got very cold. But it's the same. We're starting to see ice come out in Canada, in the Baltic already, and that's going to go forward. And then as you pick back up into April, May, June, that's when we start to see peak movements. We start to see some harvests coming in South America, which of course will draw tonnage down to the east coast of South America to move goods out of there. And of course, the Black Sea region sees the same sort of spikes. Actually, it sees its spikes in about July, August, September, as you start to get to the end of the old crop, the start of the new crop, and that's the typical season that we see, and we're expecting to see no different from that. The real question is, to what degree do the other commodities, do the power manufacturing or the steel manufacturing start to have a larger say in this market? But actually, as it looks at the moment, as I say, people are back to about 2019 levels in terms of demand. So we should, from where we're sat now, everyone's largely expecting it to be back to almost pre-pandemic levels. Rates.
So, back to an Omicron perspective, is Omicron like to prove more serious if it's still around in April than over the next couple of months? Was that fair to say, or yeah?
If Omicron really gets a hold on the world, and let's all hope that it doesn't, then that will prove a lot more serious if it's here, March, April, May, like we had in the outbreaks last year, because that's what's typically a strong period of time for shipping. But if people are working from home and not going out and not being able to work in the ports or work in those logistical sectors, we see the demand that's normally split over the course of the year, or the course of that big sort of 6 months in the middle of the year. If we see that cut to only a period of 3 months, then it only stands to reason that you've got the same number of people competing for significantly fewer ships, and therefore rates will likely rise. So that's one of the big things to watch out for, is how long does Omicron stay around for? Because the longer it stays sort of in the chain, the more expensive shipping is going to get, I think.
Got you. And of course, it's not the only event we have on the horizon. You mentioned, of course, trade wars. We'd like to perhaps just elaborate a bit on that, and when people might see that affecting.
Yeah, I mean that's a difficult one, right? Because obviously, there's so much politics attached to all these things, and maybe some of my colleagues on this call will be better sort of to answer that, certainly from the Ag's perspective. But there are expectations that these will start to ease somewhat next year, and that people will start to have those conversations, because it's in nobody's interest to have endless fracas out there in the global geopolitical landscape, because it doesn't mean that people can move goods. So how long's a piece of string? I mean, when do political decisions get made? It's an impossible question to answer. But the expectation is that we should see something, January, February, March next year, at least potentially easing some of the logistical issues we have out there.
Yeah, and thinking of China, which seems to be involved in just about every trade war there is. So, that, of course, has the Olympics coming up, the Winter Olympics, as Lunar New Year as well. Will that have an impact on the freight markets at all?
Almost certainly. Every year we see freight rates come down as China goes away for holidays, and it's always typical 2-week holiday at the start of this year, at the start of February, or next year I suppose at the start of February. And as we see demand ease from that, we should start to see sort of on the flip side, the logistical problems ease. And this year, it's of course quite a big concern. So we have Lunar New Year that's quite early, so it's the 1st of February. So we should see demand increase in December, January, as people try and move goods before that. But then it stands to reason that as we get out of Lunar New Year into the Winter Olympics, that we'll see exactly as Beijing did in 2008 when they had the Summer Olympics, that you see a real slowdown in terms of the manufacturing to try and clear up the skies and paint the most beautiful picture possible of the region of China, and so it stands to reason that we'll see the same this year or next year. Kim was saying this year, but I'm not February. It stands to reason that we'll see the same thing there, and we'll see manufacturing demand slow, which means exports will slow, and that, whilst it may not impact the price per se, will allow ports all around the world in sort of the importing regions just to shake off some of the concerns that they have, shake off some of the delays that are in the market, and that will enable freight to move a lot more easier into the future, which should, of course.
So I mean, should our ag customers then be looking at fixing freight for February? Is a good time for them to do it?
In theory, it's a great time of doing it, but no one's working in the ports, which is is the flip side of it. Yeah, rates are cheap, but
in China maybe, but elsewhere. I was just wondering how our viewers can actually prepare for this future.
That's the kind of thing now. It depends on how urgently do you need goods. If you need them as soon as possible, then book them into January, and that's what we're starting to see. A lot of people who really can't afford to wait need to book them into January, because February this year with Lunar New Year and then into the Winter Olympics is largely a write-off for moving goods ex-China. So if you need them before, or if you need them to arrive during February, you have to have moved them in January. And if you can afford to wait until they're loaded in March, just bear in mind that you won't get them until at least April, if not more likely into May.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, George, I think we'll come back to you later. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from our viewers. Thanks for that kind of very lucid kind of tour around a very large market, and we'll move on to see what other of our analysts in the AgriBriefing stable have seen in their markets. And I'll start with Helen from Strategy Grains. And perhaps you'd kind of like to introduce yourself and tell us first of all a bit about Strategy Grains, the eminent publication and one of my favourites.
Thank you, Mike. Do you hear me well?
I can hear you very well. Thank you, Helen.
Perfect. To give you a quick brief on what does Strategy Grain for some of you who don't know us yet. So the job we do is fundamental analysis based on supply and demand forecasts for cereals, oilseeds, biofuels, animal feeds, in order to predict prices trend. So we are now part of AgriBriefing since February 2021. but the company exists since 1993. So we do monthly report and updates on our website. That's how it works.
Yeah. And for your subscribers, has the shipping, the logistical prices been a big concern?
Yes, it is, because this year we have a high freight costs, like George explained it, but grain prices are much higher compared with last year, and the increase in grain prices is even more important than the increase in cost in freight costs. So the rate of costs in the final prices for importers is not so important this year than last year. But grain prices, yes, are very high. And they are very high because at the global level, we have a very bad harvest this year in North America. It was a disaster in Canada and USA. And we had lower than expected harvest in Western EU and in Russia, with in those countries of bad quality.
Got you.
We also observe that for importers countries, some of them in Middle East, like Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, we also have bad crops this year. So there is a lack of supply in the Northern Hemisphere, but there is a strong demand for importers.
And this when the shipping costs are so high.
Sorry?
And this when shipping costs are so high, which obviously is not ideal timing.
But to face these issues, there is some solution, not for all of the importers, but for some of them, it's impossible to find solution. I can give you some example. For example, in China, we observe that in the last weeks, China has imported a lot of French wheat of bad quality with a very low taste weight, trying to import cheaper wheat, waiting for the arrival of the Australian harvest. You also can see that Algeria has decided to allow to increase the rate of bug damage in imports to allow Russia to export to Algeria, to have more competition between the region and to have lower prices at the end.
Brilliant. And yes, and we've also seen, I think, some very large purchases, haven't we, by like Algeria and Egypt this week, which Egypt seemed to be thinking, well, we may be paying a lot for the wheat, but not paying so much for the shipping. I don't know if that's a good way of looking at it. Yeah. Is there anything that you feel that people could do to alleviate the problems?
There is to be sure that everything understand about the freight rate and the impact on grain prices. If you look at FOB prices, the difference between Southern Hemisphere and especially Argentina right now, the gap between Argentinian prices and European prices in FOB prices is so high that it's cheaper to import from Argentina despite the freight cost from Northern African. It's cheaper to import Argentinian wheat instead of European wheat. So on the grain market, shipping is important, but it's not the biggest element this year because there is fundamental element which lead to this sharp increase in grain prices.
Got you. So, and Argentina's going to have quite a good harvest too, I think, isn't it?
Yes, we're expecting good volumes out of Argentina for crops, good quality. And it is the same for Australia, even if there is worries about quality and damage after rains. Very
good. Thanks very much indeed for that, Helen. And now move on to Heather. Heather McGuire Doyle at Feedinfo. Pardon me. And perhaps you'd like to tell us a bit more about yourself and indeed what Feedinfo does.
Sure. I cover the global minerals market, so things like feed phosphate, copper sulfate, and then vitamins and amino acids. So these very important, small but very important ingredients that go into the animal feed. And Feedinfo is it's the world's only IOSCO compliant price reporting and news agency for the animal nutrition and additives.
Got you. IOSCO being for the uninitiated. What does IOSCO mean?
Independent oil.
Got you.
I can't do it right now.
But it means you're verified, basically, or you're independently verified, exactly.
Yes, exactly.
Very good, exactly. Right. So, and well, I mean, one market obviously that you've seen from me at Agrimoney is lysine, but what kind of stuff have you been seeing in your empire?
Yeah, lysine's a big news right now. There's a shortage of it, and it's largely tied to supply chain issues. The shortage is mostly in the Americas and Europe. There's the spot price is so high because availability is short that spot prices are above shadow price. So the shadow price is the theoretical maximum price buyers will pay, and it's determined by comparing lysine cost with soybean meal cost. So when the price exceeds shadow, then diets are changed, and we are seeing that all over the Americas, some in Europe, and that's had a knock-on effect. So as lysine is taken out of diets, more soybean meal is needed. So then we saw the surge in soybean meal because of the higher demand from the
exactly. And how is this linked to the logistics, the lysine shortage?
Yeah, so there's two brands that are used. There's an international brand and a Chinese brand. And as the supply chain cost and the delays were so crazy bad all year, there were more buyers in the Americas and in Europe, depending on the international brand of lysine. And so then that came at a time when a good portion of dry lysine supply in the US was converted to a liquid supply. And so that's a whole nother topic, but some buyers converted as best they could, but some mills they can't or they won't. So there's still this huge need for this dry lysine product. And the international sellers have done their best to keep up with demand, but there's just simply not enough supply. And then they've had their own production and hiccups. So it's been rough.
Is it production hiccups, or is it kind of containers getting stuck in Dalian or wherever else it may be that's the problem?
Well, locally in the U.S., there's some production issues. There's issues with trucks getting product across where it needs to go. But the Chinese brand, it's less coming in. It's delays, and then we were talking about options.
Yeah.
Usually it comes in through container, but some people tried to bring it in by bulk. And so that came with all kinds of issues. And there was actually a distributor in October who had to declare force majeure for some product that was damaged during the hurricanes in Louisiana. And then that came right after all the power issues in China. And so that was impossible to get material in to replace it right away. So fourth quarter is just extremely tight especially for that product.
Got you. And looking forward, is there anything that people are doing, or you could advise people to do to help ease this situation?
Yeah, I mean, the greatest concern is not having supply until after the Winter Olympics. Where buyers can, they are buying long. This actually started in the spring in the U.S. There was just for background, the U.S. depends on China for vitamins, some in Europe. There is no synthetic vitamin production in the Americas at all. So they really need that. And it is obviously coming on that Trans-Pacific route, China to the West Coast. So it's rough. So it's been really tough for them. And where they can buy long, they will. So in the spring, one of the big suppliers out of China said they were going to raise prices on their vitamin E. And you'll see that. Even if you have a pet, look on the back of the pet food. It's there. It's needed. It's important. It's important to everybody. And they said, well, if you will buy long, you can buy it at yesterday's price. So a lot of people did that because they knew it wasn't going to get better. So what we found in the fourth quarter was a little bit less buying. So a lot of buying, the first half of the year and the middle of the year, and then a little bit less buying now. But now as there's concern about, as George said, nothing available during that first quarter. Now people are starting to buy again, and then the COVID variant has made people even more concerned.
Oh my goodness, sounds a very complex situation, but a lot for you to write about.
Yeah.
Good.
Never a dull moment.
Thanks very much indeed, Heather. Right, and Gary in Ernie Barry, the prestigious protein price provider. But what can you tell us about what's going on in your markets?
Yeah, so Ernie Barry is a price reporting agency that delivers timely, accurate, unbiased quotations to center the plate protein. So those in the beef, pork, lamb, veal, seafood, egg, and poultry industries. So when we talk about what's going on in these markets, it's slightly different than some of the other speakers here, Mike. When everyone talks logistics, they think like sea freight, right? So we've been talking about containers, and that's certainly been top of mind for especially our seafood customers. We import the majority of our seafood here into the United States. So the additional cost of containers, the additional days at sea, the additional days on land that George spoke about certainly add cost structures along the line, and that has to be passed on, right? But I think I only heard it once, and Heather mentioned it, but the big thing here when we talk logistics for our customers is trucking. The U.S. has had a trucking industry that's been in decline for quite some time, and it's been exaggerated here by not only COVID, which certainly made things a lot harder. There was regional shortages, mandates for certain cities, so you had some certain areas where truckers couldn't go or maybe wouldn't go. But also the regulatory environment. California has instituted some laws recently that's made it hard on truckers as well. So you're starting to see the lack of truckers. So when you talk logistics, it's not only the sea freight that's being affected, but here in the U.S. Where we move product all across the country, it's the trucking industry that's really the one that's impacting a lot of these industries as well.
Got you. And is there anything subscribers can do to mitigate the effects of this?
No, I mean, that's always top of mind. I mean, each week it's tough, and these guys talk about it, right? So it's whatever you can get onto the truck, and if you can get a delivery date, you're going to take it, and maybe your product doesn't get on. So product availability becomes top of mind, and pricing is almost secondary. Can I get my product when I need it? And I don't really care about the price, right? And then really, that piggybacks off all this in the U.S. And I would imagine, everywhere it's labor. The product that you needed labor for when packing plants went down, when we had the initial shutdowns of plants, we had a significant supply shock across all proteins, and that never really happened before. When we had ASF, or we had African swine fever, we had BSE, and mad cow disease, or avian influenza, that hit one specific sector. The other proteins can meet the demand of consumers, but we really had a supply shock at the same time across all proteins. And then we really had a demand shock with it. Demand for proteins really increased. So you saw prices spike pretty much across the board, and price inflation, not only in the energy markets, the wage markets, the housing markets, but the food prices, food price inflation is really one of the top stories here, at this time.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. Indeed, Gary, that's really kind. Right, we'll move on to questions. First of all, I think you've raised a question I'd like to ask George, which is, in a sense, just quickly, how long, even if the shipping crisis was sorted out tomorrow, would it take for the whole logistical kind of network to get back to normal, whatever that is? And also, just to point you to a poll we're running as well, which is, in a sense, what would you like to see in a future session like this? Do you want some more on the supply chain, or looking at perhaps energy? Or we could do a regional review on China or such like, or indeed, perhaps you can give us feedback later on about something else you'd like to hear of. But George, first of all, before we move on to the Q&A, just any thoughts about how long we might be in for this, even if the shipping crisis gets sorted out tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? And it's something that I've been trying to grapple with myself, obviously before the outbreak of the new variant, which is throwing yet another spanner into the works. But it's not going to go away overnight. It's what Gary was saying, quite eloquently there, that we can now track a container shipment to within, a couple of nanometers from where it is, right? And you can see it making its way across the Pacific and then sitting in the San Pedro Bay offshore California for however long. And then you just see it sitting in a port, and you can refresh and refresh and refresh as many times. You can call up your IT guys and they'll tell you that, no, it's not your computer that's broken, it's the shipping industry that's broken. Yep, your container is simply sat in Los Angeles, Long Beach, Houston, Rotterdam, wherever it may be. And what I've been saying for a long time is that these issues are so ingrained into the system now that if demand stopped overnight, it will take months for this to for this to ease. It's all that problems. The problem is no longer on the shipping element. The problem is on the port side, on the infrastructure side. It's in the hinterlands that you can wait. I've had people that I speak to wait for 40 days with their goods in the port of Los Angeles before it then got shipped, and they were moving it inland in the US. And then it took 4 days, I think, to get up to Kansas City, which is a big hub for rail movements. And then it sat on the side of there for 7 more weeks. And so by that point, it had landed in the US 3 or 4 months ago. By the time they finally got it, the containers are all in the wrong place, and there is that labor shortage that we were speaking about earlier. And actually, it looks like if demand just stopped overnight, even based on what we already have, still waiting to be shipped, still in the pipeline of stuff that's already been ordered, it looks like it will take 6, 7, 8, 9 months for this just to end. Which is huge. I mean, even just by way of example, the port of Yantian closed for 2 weeks earlier on this year, and I think May, June kind of time, and that moved 300,000 containers a day, and it closed down to the point where they were moving. Maybe it's only 10 days they closed, but that's still 3 million container movements. And even if you go back up to 100% capacity, where are you going to get an extra 3 million container movements from, unless you have 3 million in terms of demand? So this will realistically go on for years.
If we did have another session like this in a few months' time, we might have plenty to talk about still, in other words.
Oh, yeah.
Unfortunately.
It's a never-ending joy.
Right. Move on to the questions. And there seems to be quite a few on protein, on the protein market. So I'm looking here for one from Brad Davis. As a shipper of agricultural commodities out of the US, how can we protect ourselves and still be competitive in the Southeast Asian markets when we have to book business months out with absolutely no idea what the freight rates are going to be in Q1 and Q2? If you just think about that a second. We've also got one here on, the port business. What's the outlook for port coming to the US and export to Asia? Perhaps we'll leave that one. Perhaps leave that one to Gary. And we got one similar to Brad's question. Was again on what's the outlook to container capacity for beef exports to the US? Any thoughts on that, George? On those two issues?
It's that million pound question, right? When's freight going to be cheap again? And the answer is it's not for a while. We're going to be riding a curve. It will go down as it has done before Christmas, and it will go back up again after Lunar New Year, exactly as we're expecting, and then it will go back down again. So we're almost, as somebody put it to me, we're not going to see a precipitous fall. We're not going to see it come falling off a cliff. It's going to be a bit more like a ziggurat, sort of step down, maybe a step up again, and then another few steps down. Because if you're one of the container liners, you're one of the people who moves and owns these ships. Same if you're a dry bulker. Why would you want to lose these huge profits that you're locking in at the moment? So the container shipping liners this year are anticipating to make over $150 billion profit. Just $150 billion with a B. Why would you want rates to go down? And it's really annoying if you're moving those goods, but obviously they have a perverse incentive to keep them high. The higher they keep them, the more money that they make. And so they're going to be very reluctant to put them down. And you get stuck in this same sort of bit where, can you source things more locally? That's what a lot of people are doing. Are there other options? Can you truck and train and fly them? Is that possible to make it cheaper? But can you maybe go to a different port, rather than going down to Los Angeles and Oakland, but maybe try Oakland or Vancouver or something like that up the West Coast if you can get a shipment up there. But of course, these come with their own logistical problems where they're not being serviced by the same number of people. So really, and I'm afraid that the most honest answer is, kind of got to lump it for this, like the time that we're in at the moment. There's any way that people have tried to get around this has been done. And you have big companies like Walmart, IKEA, who have chartered their own ships, their own container ships, and are now stuck in the same queues and the same delays as everybody else. But these ships that they've chartered out, chartered just means for those of you not quite au fait with the shipping container, it's like leasing a car. You take it for a period of time. And these are stuck in a queue in the San Pedro Bay in California. And every day they're costing the people who've taken them out $250,000 plus operating costs on top of that. And that every single day to be stuck in the back of a queue inside of the ports. Until we see, it's really wait and see how long and how severe the Omicron outbreak is, but also how long China are going to be off for Lunar New Year.
Yeah.
Some direction.
So I like this. I mean, in grey markets, we have a saying, the cure for high prices is high prices. So surely everyone will be bringing on new shipping next year, and happy days. There'll be lots of ships to transport beef from.
Exactly right. But even there, we're in a catch-22. The order book for shipping, for container shipping, in terms of capacity, and it's really container shipping that's doing it now, is 20% more capacity, or 10% by ship, because everyone's bringing in bigger and faster and better ships. But in 2023, we see new regulation coming out from the IMO to try and reduce the emissions that people are putting out on the high seas. And so there's starting to become this train of thought that, maybe rather than getting rid of all of our old ships to keep, supply and demand in balance, let's just go a bit slower. Because if we drop the speed by 1, 2, 3 knots, that means we're complying with these regulations suddenly, and we don't have to, get rid of these costly ships. And so almost we're starting to see this change from what we've always seen as just-in-time delivery to just-in-case delivery. People are booking goods, people are moving goods much further in advance, in the sure and certain knowledge that it's going to take longer, you're going to get stuck at the back of a queue, where previously you may have only ordered 5 or 6 weeks out. Now people are ordering in some instances 3 or 4 months out, just to make sure that it arrives as and when they expect it to.
Got you. Good. Okay, so we'll move on to perhaps the next question. We'll go back to that pork, which I think maybe Gary may have some opinion as well. So I'm in the pork business. What is the outlook for pork coming to the US and export to Asia?
So great question. I think a lot of people forgot about African swine fever during COVID, but it never really went away. It was just sitting there in the background. And now we're starting to see some emergence in the Dominican Republic, and there's concerns that it can get to either the U.S. or some U.S. territories. I think the outlook for the pork business, absence of some other things, legislative things that I'll talk about in a second, exports to Asia will probably remain strong. There has been a good demand for proteins, and not only pork, but all proteins, because China is the largest producer and consumer of pork in the world. They consume and they produce more pork than every other country combined. So when they lose, upwards of 60-70% of their hogs, they have to backfill all that demand. And they've been coming to the U.S. for not only pork, beef, seafood. They've gone to Latin America for shrimp. So it's been a broad-based need for protein. So, that hasn't gone away during COVID. It just kind of went in the background. There are some, legislative things here in the U.S. that could potentially add to cost as well. And it's known as Prop 12 in California, where they're in regards to the size of pens and how many square feet you need to have per animal in the pork industry. So that's going to affect prices as well. And if that goes through and there doesn't look like there's anything going to stop it on Jan 1, either these pork processors have to comply by culling animals, essentially killing them and not using them, or adding millions and millions of dollars of infrastructure added to their plants. So that can have a pretty big impact. So again, the outlook for pork coming to the U.S. is probably a lot less than our export business. We've been exporting more pork than recently.
Yeah, the questions are mounting up, so I have to try and crack through these quickly. Yeah. Got one here for Heather on lysine. Do you see relief in the lysine market? And if yes, what's its effect going to be on soy meal prices?
We like to watch the FOB China price to see what's going to happen in the rest of the world. And the FOB China price has held steady for the last few weeks. So that is a decent sign for the long term. But right now, there's still a big discrepancy between the replenishment cost and the spot cost. And at least for the next few weeks, it'll stay high. There is cargo booked and on the water that's coming into the U.S. between December and February. So we're kind of thinking around Christmas, you'll have a Merry Christmas. Your lysine prices will go down a little bit. But after that, everybody's thinking there's going to be more tightness between that whole February, March time when nothing's going to ship.
Great. Okay. Good. I think this one is for George. What's a crystal ball on prices? I think I've made these freight prices in 2020 to 22, so we can try to forecast price increases to help us mitigate supply chain challenges.
Difficult question, right? Asia to Europe, what people are saying is expecting by the end of next year $6,000 for a 40-foot, $3,000 for a 20-foot container, which someone put to me as being cheap, which I thought was quite an amusing thing, because compared to where we are now, it is cheap, but compared to the previous all-time high, it's 2.5 times those levels. So it really depends on how far back you're looking. And Trans-Pacific, people are saying 4,000 is probably where we're expecting to see it. So still double sort of previous rates that we've seen pre-COVID. That's just kind of where people are expecting it. So it's difficult, right? And all those other options that are out there, everybody is trying to push for different options rather than pay those higher costs. And we're seeing the same thing with annual contracts that the on the container side that people are putting in, that's then going, they're 3-4 times higher than they were a year ago, which is just going to push prices further up and keep them sustained for a while. But yeah, the idea is maybe a third of the price of where we are now is what we're expecting to see by the end of next year.
Okay, brilliant. And an ancillary question from Jeremy Higgs. What's the current freight price for Australian canola to the EU, and how much is currently moving in that direction?
Off the top of my head, I couldn't possibly say. I would probably say for a 20-footer, we're looking at about $11,000 for a container. Would be, that's real sort of back of a stamp calculation kind of thing, somewhere around $10,000 or $11,000 per container. But the issue there is not necessarily just the price, it's also the delays. It's quite a small market in comparison to some of the others. And so if you're making a lot of money Asia to Europe or Trans-Pacific, and there's going to be sustained demand throughout the year, as there has been, then lots of the shipping lines have taken capacity from sort of smaller, more bespoke trade lanes just to put them on the big lanes to make sure that they're absolutely making hay when the sun shines. And we've seen this for lots of these South America routes. Lots of ships have been pulled out of the Caribbean or servicing the African continent and have been put on those major trade lanes across the Atlantic, the Pacific, and Asia to Europe. And so it's not necessarily just price. I think Gary was saying earlier, it's not, and Heather as well, it's not just price, it's the delays as well. Like, you can pay as much as you want, but if you ain't going to get your goods, you ain't going to get your goods.
Good, brilliant. Right, Helen, one for you here, I'm afraid difficult one. Would there be a price correction for agri-commodities in 2022? What do you think will be the price drivers for 2022?
The price correction already began slightly since a week. But for 2022, we forecast a decrease in grain prices. And we do not think that forecast that the prices will collapse, but we are expecting a decrease due to few elements. To begin, the harvest in Argentina and Australia will be done in early 2022. So we will have more global supplies. And then there is a huge gap between current prices for 2021 harvest and 2022 harvest, because currently for 2022 we are expecting a rebound in production for the main cereals. So prices for the current market in Europe will decrease in 2022. But there is some issues linked to the supply chain which could lead to a slight decrease in prices. Is the fact that there is many questions currently on fertilizer availabilities, which can impact production and yields, mainly in the Northern Hemisphere countries.
Got you. Brilliant. And sorry, perhaps related to this, I'll take this one too. Would more regional lockdowns across the world really add downward pressure to grain prices? Do you understand it? So would new lockdowns because of COVID really mean downward pressure on grain markets, as we've appeared to have seen in the last few days, after all?
We saw that in 2020, but for 2022, we do not expect in lockdowns like we had very severe lockdowns. So we are not thinking of a huge impact on grain prices. But it was the case when we had the first lockdown, especially on malting barley prices due to the lower beer consumptions. The impact on prices was very important. But for 2022, it is not what we are expecting.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed. That's very lucid. Right. Gary, I'm afraid it's your turn again. I've got a question here from Monica Lutz on meat proteins. Has the balance of supply and demand normalized yet, or is there still pressure on supply going into 2022? Will the ability to pass prices along to the buyers of meat protein continue to be strong, or do you expect pushback from meat protein buyers and consumers?
So a lot of things to digest there, to right, Mike. So,
exactly.
We say the same thing here: high prices cure high prices. But there seems to be a structural, shift here. George talked about a little bit just before, with freight containers. I don't think some of the things that are causing the price increases are going away. Wage and energy inflation are huge contributors to prices, and those aren't going away. When it comes to supply and demand on the meat side, we're in a more normalized environment. Again, we're back killing just as many animals. Packers and processors are making record profits. So it's going to be hard for them to give back some of those gains. And you have consumers that here, at least in the U.S., are cash infused because of the pandemic. We had those shutdowns, but we had a lot of government assistance. We had extra unemployment benefits for those that weren't able to work. We had stimulus checks multiple times throughout 2020 and 2021. The savings rate, because people weren't commuting to the office, they weren't going on family vacations, they weren't buying lunches out, and their coffees increased from roughly on average the U.S. 7-8% up to upwards of 30%. So people still have money in their pockets, and they're buying protein at high rates, even at elevated prices. So we think there's a fundamental, shift going on. And, right now, again, labor is a big thing. So, certain items are expensive because of the labor challenges, but certain items are expensive because we have a really solid demand fundamentals in there right now. So, right now, even with supply being, back to normal levels and even above previous pre-pandemic years, we're still seeing the consumer driving prices higher. So, I think absence of anything that happens, moving forward, I think we're in a new price band for a lot of these items.
Brilliant. Right. Well, I think we're nearly out of time now. So there's, I think, there was a panel question. Given the average cost for container movements, how does the panel feel about the utilization and cost associated for air shipments as potential option for the mix of medium to high value finished goods of select size specifications? I say this in comparison volumetrically to cut flowers. Thank you. Well, perhaps, sorry, start with George. Perhaps start with our logistical expert.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to jump in on that one. I think it's very expensive still. We've talked about container rates rising 10, 12-fold over the year. But in cost of, dollars per kilogram, air freight is still 2 or 3 times as much on top of that. So people are only really doing it in extremis. But as we were sort of saying almost flippantly earlier, now it's not really about the cost. It's about whether you want to get your goods on time or not. If that's your big concern, then people will use air freight, and people are using air freight. But for most people, it's still prohibitively expensive, I would think.
Brilliant. Helen, do you have? I mean, perhaps not to apply so much to your markets, but is there a scope for air freight as far as you can see?
And then not really on this subject. For in the grain markets, volumes are so high that it's looking impossible for our field.
Got you. And has lysine got expensive enough, Heather, that it needs to be kind of air freighted in from China or wherever else?
Air freight is being used, and it has been used a lot through the year out of pure desperation. It is expensive, but we need the vitamin A.
Vitamin A. That's what it's for, is it?
All of them. We need the vitamins, so it is being used, and we're seeing it used in Europe and in the Americas. Brilliant.
And from where? From China? Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks very much. And Gary, is there a role for air freight in your markets?
So there is, specifically for the seafood markets, has been utilized in the past, but again, it comes down to really supply again, right? If we do have some global lockdowns and air freight is consumer airline lines are shut down, then you don't have the ability to put it on a plane and travel. A lot of it, at least for seafood, goes on consumer flights. They don't have air freight specifically, for seafood. It travels in the cargo bed of a plane with regular people up top. So it's going to come down to supply And if political and shutdowns happen, then certainly that can affect the availability.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all so much. Thanks indeed to George for his expert comment. Thanks to Helen and Heather and Gary as well for sparing the time for this webinar. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope indeed this will be the first of many. And do give your feedback to the poll to tell us what we should be talking about next. Thanks indeed.